There is a crisis of faith in traditional media. I think one part of that is the hyper commercialization of the media. Media outlets are driven by profit rather than by quest for the truth. I'm not a journalist myself. I feel like I haven't earned that title. There are too many people who are all too eager to adopt that title when they really don't deserve it. When they're really activists masquerading as journalists. And I think we see this happening quite a lot, particularly online. I placed a very high premium on accuracy, and that sometimes came and comes at the expense of speed. And those things are constantly in competition when it comes to news reporting. You can share facts and figures, and you can share facts and figures through a story, and the latter will almost always be vastly more compelling to an audience.
Why did you originally decide to start writing online?
I think writing is one of the most valuable skills that a person can bring to almost any job. I think writing is something that one ought to approach with a degree of awe, because you are, in some respects, bearing your soul. There is a certain risk in putting yourself out there. I think the risk is ultimately worth it.
In this episode, I had the absolute pleasure of sitting down and speaking with Avi Mayer. Avi is the immediate past editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. If you're unfamiliar with the Post, it is the most widely read English language newspaper in all of Israel, and largely considered the most widely read and most authoritative publication in the entire Jewish world outside of Israel. So globally, the most widely read paper among kind of the entire global Jewish population. And Avi, like I mentioned, was very recently their editor-in-chief. The reason that I brought Avi on this podcast, and he has a lot of other very interesting points from his backgrounds that we kind of cover in this conversation. He's met with and interviewed presidents of the United States. He was the very first person to interview the prime minister of Israel after his re-election, and the list kind of goes on. There was a poll in 2017 that named him the third most influential person on all of, quote, Jewish Twitter. So anyway, very accomplished in media and writing and news and all of those things. And the reason that I brought him on was I've covered a lot of perspectives from a lot of independent creators, independent media, and businesses that do kind of B2B journalism and B2B media. But I wanted to bring someone in from a real established legacy institution like the Jerusalem Post and learn how that is a different business from, and how they think differently about content strategy and what they have to do in terms of, do they have a different responsibility as someone seen so credible to cover the news? Do they have to, like, how do they run the show differently than, let's say, us more kind of cowboys just sending newsletters for the sake of it and trying to send newsletters in more of a business context? So there are a lot of really transferable lessons that I'm excited for you to hear from Avi. And then we also discussed kind of the impact that building a large personal brand has had over the course of his career, the writing that he's kind of continued to do even after leaving the Jerusalem Post, and why that's been so worthwhile for him to continue to do so. We discuss the trust that is built when you have a media platform and when you share news and when you publish. And as always, if you've listened to this podcast before, you'll know that we cover a whole lot more. I'm very grateful to Avi for sharing his time with me so that I can present all of these ideas to you. Without any more commentary from me, I'm going to switch over to the podcast right now. Enjoy. I've done a lot on this podcast of kind of B2B media, a lot of like businesses that have newsletters or kind of independent publishers, kind of Substack people, Beehive people. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak with you as kind of a more legacy, traditional, I don't want to say corporate, but it's just not just a kind of rogue individual, and obviously you do have a big personal brand as well, where you are, let's remove the word rogue. You're an individual sharing news and opinions and things like that, but you also bring some deep expertise representing large institutions, especially, most relevant for this conversation being the Jerusalem Post. So I'm very excited to bring that into the fold and share some perspectives from there. So thanks for being here.
I'm really delighted. This is a topic that I speak about from various angles at various times, but I think this will be a unique conversation. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Amazing. Unique's always a good goal here. I think it's not so fun for people just to hit the same talking points they run through all the time. I don't want everyone to be able to go into robot mode, right? I want everyone to show, I don't mean to like get people on the spot, but just, make it fun.
I hear you.
So the behind the scenes from, and when I say from a business perspective, I don't mean like exclusively the revenue perspective. I mean like, the strategy, like part of being a good business is having a good product or having a good readership. So when you kind of came into the Jerusalem Post, did you have a kind of mandate? Was it something like or whether that was given to you or like a personal mandate of what you wanted to do with the position of, I want to grow the readership, I want to improve the reach, I want to change the way we handle these topics. Like, what were kind of those big aims you had when you stepped up to the helm?
So I came to the Jerusalem Post by something of a circuitous route. I was not a journalist before taking the helm of this legacy newspaper. I'd worked with media in communications for many years, and I knew the industry, but from sort of the outside. And when I came in, I was joining an institution that is older than the state of Israel. The Jerusalem Post predates the country itself by quite a few years, and that had its own way of doing things. And the first column that I wrote as editor-in-chief set out what I viewed as our values. And I spoke about the importance of integrity, the importance of fact-checking, of ensuring that we're getting the story straight, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. And I also spoke about some of the values that guide me as an individual that I think should be guiding the paper. Things like being an anti-racist paper. We won't give airtime to views that we find just despicable and abhorrent, even if we are at the same time presenting views that we may disagree with. Anything that targets individuals because of their innate characteristics had no place in our paper. I stated that we are a Zionist paper. We believe in the Jewish state's right to exist and the Jewish people's right to self-determination in the land of Israel, and we weren't going to provide airtime to views that think that Israel doesn't have right to exist, or the Jews should not have the same rights as other people. And so those are some of the principles that sort of undergirded my approach to my leadership of the Jerusalem Post. And I really sort of entered that realm with the goal of fostering a global conversation on the issues that matter. The issues that matter to Israel, the issues that matter to the Jewish people, the issues that matter to the Middle East, and the issues that matter to the world. That, I think, is the role of an Israeli newspaper. That's what I viewed as my role as the editor-in-chief, while at the same time, there are also certain revenue goals. I was not responsible for the business side of the newspaper. There's an entirely sort of separate and parallel operation that does that. I was responsible for the editorial team, meaning the journalists, the editors, the graphic designers, the copy editors, and things like that. But of course, a newspaper is a business like any other, and there are certain revenue goals which have to be met. And sort of straddling that line and figuring out how to ensure that the revenue goals were met, that we were able to sustain ourselves as a paper, and be constantly providing our owners, our publisher, with what he felt he needed to keep this business running, while at the same time staying true to our editorial values and those things that I set out at the beginning. I think that was a dynamic that I had to navigate constantly throughout my leadership of the paper.
How do you say the way that you think about or thought about content strategy kind of differed? You could say ideologically or also kind of strategically in terms of serving like what's going to be effective in retaining readership and retaining trust, not just, I think it's important to spread these values. I mean, you can kind of speak to the question on both levels compared to, let's say, predecessors or successors.
Look, I have a lot of regard for other folks who have held that role. The founder of the newspaper, Gershon Agron, went on to become mayor of Jerusalem. We have some pretty big names who led the Jerusalem Post, and I realized that I was standing on the shoulders of giants. And I think I learned a lot from the history of the paper and those things that were put in place by my predecessors, while also wanting to sort of stake out a territory of my own. I placed a very high premium on accuracy, and that sometimes came and comes at the expense of speed. And those things are constantly in competition when it comes to news reporting. I've heard from other journalists and editors in the field that they don't have the same emphasis on accuracy. To them, the most important thing is being the first folks out with a given piece of information. I constantly pressed my team to get the story right. And I said, I'm happy with being second as long as we're the ones getting the story right. And that was something that I emphasized pretty consistently throughout. I think also providing a multiplicity of views, ensuring that a wide variety of views were represented in the pages, particularly of our opinion section, that we were getting perspectives from right and left, men and women, folks in Israel and around the world. That was something I was constantly pressing for and I thought was extremely important. I didn't want us to be viewed as a paper that is on this side of the political spectrum or the other. I think that for many years the paper did have a certain reputation. That reputation evolved over the years, but it was very important to me that we be viewed as a centrist paper, one that is a home or could be a home to anyone who falls within sort of a mainstream tent, while of course, as I said earlier, leaving certain extreme views or views that we find abhorrent outside that tent. And I think that the last thing I would say is integrity. Ensuring that we are taking responsibility, that we own up to mistakes. And every organization, every paper does make mistakes, and we were no exception. There were several examples of quite egregious mistakes that took place on my watch that, of course, were unpleasant. But I said, it's our responsibility to take ownership of that and do whatever we can to A, atone for it, and B, make sure that we don't make those mistakes again. And I think that that's something that we also did with a great deal of success during my time there.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing everything you're saying through the lens of positioning, in terms of I've worked with a lot of businesses and individuals in launching their publications or revising their publications. And the way I want to start all those conversations is, right, obviously the goal might be to drive some conversion outcome if it's for a business. It's to make sales, but the way that we're doing that is you want to be seen in a certain way. And so I like hearing the way that, you have a very clear picture. Like I was about to ask the question, then you just kind of kept elaborating on it, where what is the impression, when, someone thought of the Jerusalem Post, what was the thought you wanted them to have? And that's kind of, just reiterating what are the values, but you want that to be something that someone external could say without a doubt, right? It's they're the accurate paper, they're the centrist paper, they're the neutral paper, they're the...
I honestly, I think the word that I would use perhaps above any other is trust. I want us to be a trusted source. I want people to trust that even if they are confronted with uncomfortable facts or perspectives, that they are doing so in a forum that is thoughtful, that is deliberate, that has integrity, and that they know that the folks who produce this content will stand behind it. And they will own up to whatever errors will be made, and we'll do whatever we can to correct them.
Yeah. Would you say I conduct this question very much kind of from an armchair quarterback position, right? I haven't done proper research or polling and anything in a scientific sense. It's more of a general collective sense of, I think there's plenty of data to support it, but in the US, it feels like, and especially in my peer groups, just a complete distrust in legacy media, especially on Twitter. You'll see people tweet all the time, you don't hate the media enough, you don't distrust the media enough. And, candidly, I resonate with a lot of that, which is why at least I resonate with that with the US news institutions, because that's what I'm most familiar with and what I feel like I've lost the ability to trust in over time. Because I've missed it, but I feel like the inaccuracies and the egregious mistakes, maybe not in the same way that you've done, there haven't been the formal apologies. There hasn't been the sense of real, genuine, not guilt, but you feel bad. You're I'm sorry that we made this mistake, maybe remorse rather than guilt, because, it's an honest mistake and we feel bad about it. Whereas we feel maybe here, some of them feel genuine or careless. Would you say that's as pronounced in Israel? Would you say that's a trend you think it's accelerating, decelerating? How do you feel kind of holistically there?
Look, I think that there is a crisis of faith in traditional media. I think that is attributable to a series of causes. I think one part of that is the commercialization of the media, and the fact that it seems at times as though media outlets are driven by profit rather than by a quest for the truth. And I think that affects the ability of the audience to take what these outlets are producing seriously, and to put their trust in them. I think there's also this increasingly blurred line between news reporting and opinion writing, which I think is deeply unhealthy. I was very insistent on there being a wall between our news pages and our opinion pages, and I did not want that line blurred. Unfortunately, you don't see that in a lot of places. And, my goal in producing news reporting was that the audience have no idea where the reporter stands politically. And I don't know that there are many news publications that hold themselves to the same standard. I think you find loaded language. I think you find um, uh, biased terminology finding its way into news reporting in ways that would have been viewed as egregious and completely out of bounds up until a few years ago. And I think that that also erodes general trust in the ability of traditional media to serve as a fair platform for reporting and for unbiased information. And I think the last thing I would say is that the ability that exists today for individuals to serve the kind of role that we used to have to rely on journalists to do. So, the ability to pick up your iPhone and use it to report from a scene, to express your views, to reach really large audiences in ways that were really only available to the traditional media in the past, has caused many to wonder whether the traditional media has the same role to play today as it has. And I still do think that there is an added value to traditional media. I think that a media outlet, when it's run properly and when its editors hold themselves to the proper standards, should be expected to have a certain degree of integrity, should be expected to have a certain degree of credibility and gravitas that you can't really expect from an individual with an iPhone. But the question is whether that is actually coming to bear, and whether you're actually seeing that in that reporting, and whether that standard is actually being met.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, is kind of to the original point about the label news. Like, I find it oftentimes, it's kind of like goes back to, and you could say it's a biblical concept because it is, but like just the power of naming in general. So like, I always kind of have this argument with my my parents and my grandparents. They're like, oh, I'm turning on the news. I'm like, are you turning on a news program? Or are you turning on like a, entertainment program that is just like, I think I don't want to, be legislative here, but I think like to some extent it should be, it's like difficult that it's, again, like I'm speaking not too thoughtfully, but like labeling it as the news kind of feels like there's a power that comes with that. There's responsibility by making that claim. And then like, I think certain people like, the FCC in the United States, like there's certain claims you're not supposed to make because they're misleading. And like just labeling certain platforms as news when they've just drifted so far from that being their kind of stated purpose, where it's like, no, this is primarily a for-profit advertisement channel. This is like, if I think about the newsletters that we write often, right? We write entertaining, educational content about business so that someone builds a relationship with this brand so we can sell them products and services. That's like in a simple sense. And, the CNN, the Fox, the MSNBC feel like we provide people with political entertainment loosely inspired by current events so we can sell them pharmaceuticals. That kind of feels like my understanding of a lot of like the major stuff, which is why I've kind of drifted in this way. So I like how but I also, and again, what I've really wanted to kind of dive into with you is not being so, I don't say short-sighted to just throw out, well, therefore all of it's bad and there's nothing to be gained from it. Because I think especially, I'm an entrepreneur, spent very little time working in kind of corporate environments. I think I was also very careless to say, well, there's nothing to learn from these big companies. They're inefficient. They do these silly things. But then, and the same thing with the university system. Like, oh, there's nothing to learn from colleges. You can just learn everything on YouTube. But you do oftentimes throw a lot of good out. It's like, okay, well, we've pointed out some very genuine criticisms, but like maybe you can come to bat. Like, what are some of the genuinely useful functions you see them continuing to serve? Some advantages, maybe it's just from like being resourced versus individuals not being resourced. Like, how do you see some of those in defense of, or what values go unappreciated from, having a big team who's solely focused on this rather than kind of an individual, on throwing off fire off tweets?
So I have several answers to that, but before I jump into it, I do want to relate to your point about labeling. I have been active in the Twitter sphere for years, right? I have several 100,000 followers, and I would find myself occasionally labeled by others as a journalist. And I was always very firmly opposed to that. And I said, I'm not a journalist. I don't hold myself to the same uh, institutional standards as journalists should. I do try to hold myself to, a certain degree of credibility. I want to make sure that I can continue to be treated seriously. I do, in some respects, and I did prior to running the Jerusalem Post, hold myself to standards that may be regarded as journalistic ones in terms of fact checking and so on. But I was always very almost awestruck by the label of journalist, because I really do hold that label in very high regard. And even, by the way, when I ran the Jerusalem Post, right, like one would say that is the pinnacle of journalistic achievement, right? You're running a newspaper. I still said, no, I manage journalists. Like, I'm not a journalist myself. I feel like I haven't earned that title. And I feel as though there are too many people who are all too eager to adopt that title when they really don't deserve it. When they're really activists masquerading as journalists. And I think we see this happening quite a lot, particularly online, on Twitter X, on Instagram, maybe on TikTok as well. Folks who declare themselves independent journalists when really they're just activists who are using the same medium as everyone else in order to project their views to the world without holding them to any critical standards. And I think that critical standards are a piece of what gives traditional media a leg up, or ought to give traditional media a leg up when compared to some of the upstarts that we see in the world today. I think that the ability to fact check, the ability to ensure that you are researching a story, that you're getting multiple perspectives, that you're talking about background, all of that is expected of legacy media. Again, whether those outlets always achieve those standards is a different question. I'm happy to get into that. And I think, unfortunately, all too many outlets don't get there. But in an ideal world, when a media organization works properly, there are mechanisms put in place to ensure that the facts are correct. That there is a fact-checking process going on, that an editorial page is curated in such a way as to provide a multiplicity of views, that the reader really does get a variety of perspectives on the issues of the day. And again, that is not expected of someone with an iPhone. You're not asking them to provide you with the multiplicity of views. At the very most, you're expecting them to portray their view. And there's something to be said for that, right? We're all entitled to our opinions, but that does not a journalist make. And I think that that is a significant difference between an individual, even one with a huge online following, and a media organization that has these mechanisms and these safeguards put in place to ensure that their audience is as well informed as possible.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a few important themes. The one I kind of always admire romantically, the kind of just anyone with like a craftsman ethos that holds like a craft as like something to be revered and something to be respected. The craft of writing, the craft of being a journalism, like the craft of being an engineer, like taking seriously what that means in terms of like it's an identity, but it's also like an earned identity. Like you're really like an aspiring until you are an actual, right? And there's like an apprenticeship process. And so kind of like this, it's like, if not the perfect word, but like a libertarian bent of like, there's nothing good about credentials. There's nothing good about institutions. It's like, well, maybe, there's a series of tests. There is a baseline before you should really consider yourself a journalist, an engineer. And so it's a tough line to divide, because again, so much of the time these things are corrupted and there's not, accountability mechanisms on the institutions, and they become, there's kind of an expression like a Costco for degrees almost. And you don't want that either, but.
Well, but just to that point, I mean, what you're saying is 100% correct. And I agree with it. I think journalism is absolutely a craft. The question is, who's the arbiter, right? Who gets to designate someone a journalist or not? I think that's when you get into dicey questions of freedom of expression, right? Who are we to say that such and such a person is or is not a journalist? Now, I think that there are certain hallmarks and certain indications of whether or not someone is or is not a journalist. We can talk about what those are. But once you sort of enter the realm of, certifying that someone is a journalist or not, granting or denying that title, it's more complex than perhaps some might think.
Yeah. I want to ask some questions about kind of the personal brand, kind of individual side. So like now you're less so your career as the, editor-in-chief of the Post, and now in terms of the parallel track in your career, which is just building this following and kind of the influence that you've had. Let's stay on the theme of crafts for a moment. What are some things you learned as like a writer specifically, like the boot camp? Even think about like a sales organization. A lot of people come in to a company like, oh, I know how to do sales, I know how to hustle. And then you hire someone who's worked at like Zoom Info. It's like, okay, that person like has the discipline of a salesperson. So maybe like, did you kind of see yourself, your writing skills, your disciplines, the standards you set for yourself individually as a writer change from that experience, or was it kind of late enough in your career?
I think one thing that I've always known to be true, but that I think was perhaps highlighted for me by the experience of the Post, is the importance of storytelling. You can share facts and figures, and you can share facts and figures through a story, and the latter will almost always be vastly more compelling to an audience. And so I had a weekly column that I wrote every Friday at the Post. And I always tried to start with some kind of anecdote, some kind of story, some kind of historical incident as a way of sort of drawing the audience in and illustrating something that I was then going to lay on them in facts, figures, and in various other sort of concrete ways. And I think that that's something that has evolved over time. And something I'm a very firm believer in. I think storytelling is absolutely critical. I still do believe in long form journalism. Even though I do operate in the Twitter sphere, and I know that in some respects I'm limited to 280 characters, although now you can write a little bit more. I still think that there's value in diving into subjects and getting your hands dirty and sort of getting into the depths of whatever it is that you're writing about. I think that reaches a certain audience that wants that kind of thing. And that's the audience I really want to be interacting with. I think that there is certainly value to pithy one-liners and catchphrases. I think that those are important. They serve a certain function in drawing attention. But I would love to be cultivating a deeper conversation, one that's more profound. And so to me, maintaining a weekly column was my way of diving into the issues in a serious and thoughtful manner. And I think sort of expecting the same of my team, of the staff, ensuring that we were being thoughtful, that we weren't just approaching things from a superficial perspective, but rather writing in a way that was compelling, that was based on research, on speaking to multiple sources and cross-referencing information and ensuring that we were getting at the issues of the day in as comprehensive a way as possible, I think was really a hallmark of my work there. And I think it's something that I'll carry with me wherever I go next.
Another role you've played is the interviewer. And that's kind of another interesting one, continuing on this theme of like craft and credentials and like, what does it mean to, anyone can be an interviewer. You interview people. Now you're an interviewer. But to be a good one, you've done like, I read in your bio and I've heard before that you conducted the first newspaper interview for the PM of Israel after his election. I mean, that's a big interview, right? There's not really any other way of putting it. How did you go about preparing for a conversation like that?
Well, we knew that the prime minister is a very busy person, and there was a protracted negotiation about when this interview was to take place and how much time we were going to have. Originally, I thought we were going to have like a huge chunk of time. We were then told we were going to have very little time. We ended up meeting somewhere in the middle. But that meant that we had to be extremely targeted in the subjects and the questions we were going to ask. So I actually brought a colleague who at the time was a Jerusalem Post diplomatic correspondent who worked closely with the Prime Minister's office. And we sat down and discussed what are the most important things for our audience to hear about at this moment. What are the things we absolutely need to ask the Prime Minister about? And we had the back and forth. We crafted the questions between us. We decided who was going to ask which thing. And we sort of dove into it. I think we pretty much stuck to the questions we had intended to ask. I think we may have added one or two follow-up questions based on what the Prime Minister said. But I absolutely agree with you. A good interview has to be well prepared. The questions have to be succinct, and they have to elicit the kinds of responses that are going to be of greatest value to your audience and aren't going to let the interviewee get away with, some kind of bromide or some kind of superficial throwaway response. the prime minister is a very talented communicator. And so, there were a lot of lines there that I think were meant to send a certain message that weren't necessarily what we had asked him to respond to, but that's certainly his prerogative as an interviewee. And then after we conducted the interview, we did several things. First of all, we put the full video of the interview online, unedited. We didn't take anything out. We wanted our audience to see the full conversation without any editorial input. We wrote several articles on the basis of that interview, sort of diving into it, explaining what he said, what he didn't say, and so on. And I wrote my column that week as sort of an analysis and processing of that interview. I called it the Netanyahu doctrine. The themes that I saw emerging from that conversation that gave some insight into his decision making and the way he approaches his role. So it was a wonderful opportunity. I'm glad we had it. Of course, at the same time, we also conducted interviews with a variety of his political opponents, which I think is also critically important for any serious newspaper. But I absolutely agree with you that interviewing is a skill and one that's constantly honed.
Yeah, I love one of the main reasons I do the podcast, like continue to, is that from just doing one interview, you have so much it's the anchor, right? It's like for anyone who's responsible to continue to like have ideas, just like having one really thoughtful conversation every week, every 2 weeks, just gives you so much material to continue to work with. So it's like you have the, if we're thinking as a business, yes, you have like the one piece of content to share, which is just the video, but then it also just, well, what did he not talk about and why is that? And what does that mean? And then, okay, well, now let's go. Just the amount of launching off points from just one simple conversation is incredible. It doesn't have to be an interview. It can be a newsletter or a column, but like committing to publish at least one thing weekly just completely sets a cadence to your life and just like sets a baseline. I think, after a lot of people leave school, they lose like learning and they don't have to they're the kind of the joke in America is like email jobs is what people call them. They just get like an email job and then your learning kind of stops, especially like in an intellectual sense. Maybe you're learning subtle things, but committing to do an interview, write something every week just keeps you in the student mindset of like, you like always think like metaphorically, like you never like write by pen and paper. Like, do you feel rusty or you're always like in the groove of like you still know how to use your hand, or like, does it feel weird to write? I'm curious, over the arc of your career, I mean, obviously it's opened the door of the position at the Post. What are some of the other, like, why did you originally decide to start writing online? And, what's kind of the impact that in parallel having this personal brand has had on your career? Is it something that, I imagine your takeaway is that it's been worth the effort, but to, as someone, whether it's an individual, young person, old person, business owner, not business owner, like, is the whole personal brand thing worth the effort?
So I've always been a writer. I've been a writer for as long as I've known myself. I established my high school newspaper. I was on the editorial board of my college newspaper. I was an editorial cartoonist. I was the opinion editor of the Jewish newspaper on campus. And yet I opted not to pursue journalism as a career. And I went sort of back and forth on this, and I did an internship in college for JTA, which is a Jewish news agency, at their DC bureau. And I remember having conversations with the bureau chief at the time, who just recently retired, about whether or not to pursue journalism as a career. And I really sort of agonized over this, but I decided that it wasn't the right path for me, and I decided to go a different direction, but one that also involved a great deal of writing. As sort of the head of communications for a series of Jewish organizations. But I think writing is one of the most valuable skills that a person can bring to almost any job. There are obviously some jobs where it's perhaps less necessary. If you have a very technical coding position, or if you're working with machinery, maybe it's not quite as necessary to be a competent writer. But in almost any corporate environment, any organizational environment in which you're expected to interact with others and provide written content, or even just liaise or correspond with people, being a talented writer is an absolutely critical skill. And I think that has been something that I've noticed throughout my career. Some of the employees that I've had, some of the colleagues that I've had over the years who I have most respected have been those who have been able to express themselves through writing. And I have to say, as someone who has from time to time had to hire people, that is probably one of the most important skills, one of the most important qualities I look for in a potential employee: their ability to write, to express themselves compellingly, concisely, without errors, or with as few errors as possible. Um, and I think that's really quite important. Now, the advent of AI and Chat GPT challenges that notion, because anyone could be a good writer by offering Chat GPT a prompt and having it produce whatever it is that you're looking for. But ultimately, I think that the kind of thinking that goes into in-depth writing, the kind of creativity that is inherent in providing thoughtful written responses to whatever the situation might require. I think that those are skills that will be valuable well into the future, regardless of what advances we see with AI. So I absolutely am a very firm believer in writing, and I have to say, I as you suggested, do attribute a lot of the professional achievements that I've had to the importance that I've placed on writing over the years. And I'm hopeful that my employers have seen that as well.
Yeah, to that, kind of in every, I'm, as big of an advocate for writing as I can be, except for the fact that I'd always aspire. There's no amount of like writing where I'm like, I'm writing enough. Like I always feel like I'm not doing enough writing. Maybe there's an upper limit to that eventually, but I feel like I'm nowhere near it. For kind of all the benefits you've stated, when you think about, like you said, on the personal note and on the hiring note, it's, you always de-risk something. Like writing de-risks something because it reveals information. So
Mm-hmm.
like when you want to get a job, what are you trying to communicate to this person? Like, I understand these ideas very well. Like the ideas or principles related to this field. I'm a clear thinker. I'm organized. I'm competent. You can like tell someone all those things, or you can demonstrate all those things, and they already know that. Right. Same thing with, and by writing. So it's like they read your body of work. Like I think about the first guy I hired as our first writer. I mean, it makes sense that I hired a writer who had a portfolio, but like I was just someone I just made small talk with in a very like natural situation. He's like, oh, by the way, he's like, oh, you have a writing business. I have a blog. I read his blog. I'm like, this guy's funny. He's witty. He's punchy. He understands tone and cadence and rhythm. Like immediately I was in, like, I wasn't, it's a night and day difference reading a portfolio from someone with writing samples without one versus without one.
And again, I mean, look, it is definitely more challenging now, right? Like my sister is an English teacher, um, and she tells me about the challenges she and her colleagues are facing in requiring students to write essays. They know that these students can very easily go into ChatGPT, provide it with whatever prompt the teacher has assigned, and have it provide a very compelling written response. And so it will require some creativity on the part of whether it's educators, employers, journalists, and others, to figure out, has this content been created originally by the individual submitting it, and what does it actually say about the person who is producing that content? And it's a brave new world, and I'm eager to see how we navigate that. But I think it'll be an interesting place for us to be in the next few years.
One of my favorite questions, and I think the only one I've consistently asked every time since the rebrand, has been, what has been the most impactful piece of content you've been involved in creating? And I like to give some options here to kind of help people think of a variety of potential answers. It could be something that you just wrote on your own that got a lot of reach, a lot of appeal, a lot of comments. Could have been like a big piece that you just were collaborate on in some capacity, and the impact can be thought of as like, again, reach or unexpected opportunities, or like I mentioned a moment ago, just simply the most discussed. Maybe something people are still talking about. Those, I don't know if any particular piece of content comes to mind.
So I would say that over the years, I've written any number of pieces that have gotten broad resonance and have generated strong feedback, either supportive or critical. There are a few pieces like that jump to mind, and that still today, quite a long time after I've written them, are mentioned to me from time to time by people I meet. But there are some that do stand out. I would say one of them is a piece I wrote the night of October 7th, 2023, just hours after the Hamas massacre in the south of Israel. And it was a really horrific day in so many respects. The fog of war is a very real thing, and we were very much mired in it for the first few hours. And once the smoke started to clear and the enormity of this horror started unfolding, I sat down and wrote a piece that appeared on the front page of the next day's paper on October 8th, the title of which was "This is Israel's 9/11." And it was the only point of reference that we had at the time. In retrospect, we now know that it was actually several orders of magnitude greater than 9/11 was in the United States, just in terms of the number of people killed relative to the overall population. But it was language that I felt that I needed to use because it was the only comparable experience that any of us had to explain the shock, the horror, the carnage, and the trauma that we were all experiencing. And that is one piece that stands out to me. I still reference it from time to time. I've reread it several times over. This was, I probably sat down and started writing it about 12 hours after October 7th started, about 6:30 a.m. on that morning. And this was obviously that evening. We still had no idea just how enormous this was. I think at the time I referenced a couple hundred people who had been killed when the ultimate number was 1,200. And we knew that a few people had been abducted. We didn't know there was 251. And so in retrospect, it almost seems naive to make that comparison because it's actually 9/11 coupled with Pearl Harbor, coupled with, any number of other horrific incidents over history. That is the magnitude of what we experienced that day. And yet it was my attempt at that moment to make some sense of what we were experiencing and put that experience in words. And I think that's a piece of content that stays with me to this day.
Yeah, I don't have I'm gonna make it's a very incomplete comparison because I have nothing with the same gravity to really compare it to. So I'm gonna apologize if I'm making a poor comparison here, but I think and it's not true 100% of the time, but those pieces that are the most emotionally raw and emotionally vulnerable, where you're kind of afraid to hit send. Like I think, when I say I've written those, there are things that I've been hesitant to share on, a tiny fraction of the order of magnitude of what you've described. But just as a principle of like how humans relate to other humans and what creates the trust or what maybe breaks down the barriers to trust is a piece that is just so, and this comes back to the AI conversation, is something that is so evidently human and real. And it's something that would have been, impossible to, something that you can just tell this person is expressing genuine vulnerability and just like sharing openly when they produce. So I think that more often than not, that's a common pattern of things that I hear when I ask this question.
I think writing is something that one ought to approach with a degree of awe, because you are, in some respects, bearing your soul and expressing it in a way that you really can't easily take back. Once it's in writing, once it's out there, it's out there. And you can issue a correction or, your views can evolve over time. But I'm very cognizant of the fact that anything I write is out there forever. And so, I always encourage people, as my father once told me, never put anything in writing that you don't want to see as a headline in the New York Times. I think that's a helpful way of thinking about writing and ensuring that you're not being frivolous in how you express yourself and the things that you say. And I, have said things over the years that have been, fairly strongly worded and that have expressed pretty strong views that I hold. I still stand behind, I think, pretty much all of it. And there is a certain risk in putting yourself out there. I think the risk is ultimately worth it. And I think that bearing your soul through writing can often be a very enriching and almost therapeutic way of processing information and experiences. So it's something I certainly encourage people to do, but I also encourage them to do so with a great deal of care and caution.
Yeah, the first thing that came to my mind was like, everything you put in writing has as an implication. And the number I saw when I was kind of reviewing your Twitter account and reviews, I only use Twitter on Tuesdays now, which is like something I've done for years. Then I took a break during, if I fell off the course, then I kind of unimportant, but it's been very good. Basically, since the election, I'm like, all right, there's nothing I actually need to keep up with more than once a week. And even that, I obviously didn't need to keep up with once a week, but that was like the last decent excuse I had. And since then, so anyway, the time in which we scheduled this interview until like which we actually had it, that had like 2 Tuesdays, and I forgot to use Twitter on the previous Tuesday. So like this morning was the only time I actually had Twitter to use as part of the research process. Everything else I kind of just, fortunately, you're enough other places where I wasn't really shut out. But this is a long-winded way of saying that, you've put out 75,000 tweets. So, and you said like anytime you put something online, you're kind of accountable to those words. It's a lot of volume. But
yeah. And occasionally someone will take an old tweet of mine and thrust it in my face and say, do you still believe that? And I'll say, yeah, I still do believe that. Or, that was reflecting information that was relevant at the time, and here's some more information that supplements or changes that. But, once you put it out there, you got to stand behind it. It's your words.
Amazing. Well, we're coming up on the end here. Avi, what are you up to these days? You're on Twitter, you're still writing, not at the Post anymore. What's next for you? Where can people find you? I'm kind of curious to hear all that.
Well, you can still find me on Twitter or X. I'm active there. I'm active to a lesser degree and a less successful degree on Instagram. And of course on LinkedIn and Facebook and so on. My time at Jerusalem Post was a moment in my career. It was an extremely intense experience, and one that I think I learned a great deal from. It was never my goal. I had never set out to run a newspaper. It was an opportunity that sort of came out of nowhere, and I seized. And I've found that being the former editor of the Jerusalem Post has opened many doors that I perhaps couldn't have anticipated prior to that experience. So I do quite a lot of public speaking. I'm invited quite often to various Jewish communities and others, universities, and various other settings around the world to share a perspective on what's been going on in Israel. I think a lot of people are interested in what's been happening in this part of the world, particularly over the past 15 months. And that has been an extremely edifying and fulfilling experience for me. I've opened a consultancy, and I've been working with a series of major Jewish organizations and senior figures in the Jewish world and in Israel to sort of find the words and the way to convey their connection to what's been happening, their connection to Israel at this time. I think a lot of organizations and individuals, frankly, have found that challenging over this period. And writing. I still write in a variety of different formats and places. Obviously, I'm not sure I would consider my social media posting to be writing in a classical sense, but I think some might consider it to be so. I had started writing a book prior to joining Jerusalem Post, and I have re-engaged in that process now. And I try to write op-eds from time to time to, reclaim some of that I think sacred time that you described earlier, having a sort of constant drumbeat of content that you're putting out that enables you to process the events of the day or of the week or of the period and forces you to do so in a thoughtful way is something that I have always found to be valuable, and something that I've been continuing to do as well.
Amazing. Well, Avi, I'm very grateful to you for, of course, the roles you've played in the Jewish world, and then obviously your time here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Had a great time.